Good morning. It still is Binanceans, and welcome to episode 5 of Binance Beach. This is your weekly Aussie crypto briefing, and I am stoked to be back with you and joined by the one and only Adam Stokes today. He's an economist, a crypto commentator, an author, and an animal lover, as am I. So we'll kick it off. I'll pull him up. Welcome, Adam, to Binance Beach this week. How you doing?
G'day, Liam. Great to see you and an honor to be here.
Fantastic. Today, we're going to dive into some critical updates from the Bitcoin 2024 conference that was held this week in Nashville. And we were talking about this just before we've kicked off, but I think we both believe that this is one of the most important updates and important conferences in the history of Bitcoin and the history of crypto. It included speakers, including politicians such as, of course, former President Donald Trump, presidential candidate R.F. Kennedy Jr., and Senator Cynthia Lummis, alongside the normal host of greats, Saylor, Cathie Wood, Edward Snowden, and many more. And we're going to digest a few of the key and critical updates that were announced at the conference. And then we're going to pivot to why Bitcoin matters so much for everyday Aussies right now in the world we find ourselves in. So let's kick it off. Let's start with our price update. Bitcoin's pretty flat on the week, down just 1%. Definitely feels like we've been trading in this 60 to 70K range for a little while now. And I've started to even hear the market start to describe itself as boring a little bit. We have had quite a bit of movement there, though, this week. A little bit of bullishness earlier in the week, and we moved up towards the $69,000 mark, which we almost look like we might be moving towards all-time highs. And then we dropped off the back of some potential uncertainty about rate cuts later in the year in the US, down towards the $62,000 mark. Adam, any comments on the Bitcoin price this week and what's driving markets?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you said, it gets a little bit boring. And the irony is that when the market is volatile, people say, well, it's too volatile, it's too scary. Yet then when the market is stable, it's like, well, it's boring. So to the normies, they criticize it when it's too volatile, and to the crypto goers, we criticize it when it's too boring. So we can't win either way. But for me, it's a fantastic accumulation phase. We can see that DCAing seems to be the best approach in many of the blue chip shares out there, if you will, the blue chip cryptos. But ultimately, what's very interesting is that it appears at times we correlate with the traditional markets, and other times we don't correlate. We can see that the traditional markets are pumping at the moment, whilst we're pulling back. But Liam, as you know, it's difficult to say, well, what is a pump or a dump in crypto? Because we move so quickly, and in a traditional market, a pullback of 4 to 5% is a catastrophic fall. But for us, it's just another day in crypto. Ultimately, I'm still feeling very, very bullish. And for me, I'm also very grateful that it's just a little bit more time to accumulate before we go ballistic.
Absolutely. An accumulation phase, I think, is a great way to describe the last couple of months as we've sat in that pretty consistent price range. In terms of local key economic updates, the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index for Q2, came out this week. Annual CPI inflation increased to 3.8% in our June quarter. And we're looking here at data from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And that's up from 3.6% in the March quarter. This is the first time we've had an increase in the annual CPI since December 2022. And the most significant price rises were around housing, which continues to, I think, be a key topic of conversation in the country, around food and non-alcoholic beverages, clothing and footwear, and alcohol and tobacco. We're going to cover a little bit more about CPI later as well, and why this could be a reason to consider Bitcoin in Australia. But did you have any comments on the CPI, Adam, before we move into Bitcoin Nashville?
Always got to comment on the CPI, and I'm glad you brought it up, Liam, because I'm very critical of the CPI. I'm more about core inflation, and of course, whether it's the left or right of politics, they need to calm the masses and make out that things aren't as bad as they seem. But of course, inflation is out of control. When we actually ask the humans out there in real life, as opposed to charts and those doing analytics in the background through algorithms, we can in fact see that inflation is much higher than any chart here we can see. We know that the cost of living has gone up significantly: food, energy, rent, just all that stuff that you need to live. And then when we play with the CPI, it appears that evidently they move whatever they like into the CPI basket to get a better rate. But ultimately, when we go to what they're going to do with the interest rate in response to the CPI, kind of damned if they do or damned if they don't. If they want to try to slow down inflation through punishing the people by raising the interest rate, we're going to put the whole economy in a world of hurt. But if they lower the interest rate, it picks up the spending, and away inflation goes again. So this is where we move to the antithesis of the issue of fiat, and that's where we move into Bitcoin, the fair, hard, sound, immutable, scarce, real money.
Perfect segue. Let's talk about Bitcoin 2024. First up, we had Michael Saylor present one of, I think, the most bullish presentations that I've ever watched, and it's a fantastic presentation. I highly recommend everyone go and check that out. He boldly predicted that Bitcoin's market cap could reach 280 trillion. For reference, it currently sits around the 1 trillion mark by 2045, so in the next 20 years. And he stated there's a base case of around $13 million per Bitcoin and a bull case of $49 million per coin, which is phenomenal. He also went through the potential outcomes for a Bitcoin strategy for individuals, for companies and corporations, and for nation states. It's a fascinating watch, and I highly recommend. But on the policy side of things, this is where Bitcoin 2024 really set itself in history as one of the most significant, if not the most significant conference in history. Trump, of course, made a couple of key promises. He, and this is a quote, said the US would become the crypto capital of the planet. He vowed to dismiss current US SEC chair Gary Gensler on his first day back in office. And he promised to ensure that the US government strategically holds over 200,000 Bitcoin, which it currently has acquired, mainly through enforcement actions. And he promised to hold that as a strategic asset. And then, of course, he added that he would create a mandate for the adding Bitcoin to the US government Treasury Reserve. So this was a really interesting and really landmark bunch of statements from Trump. There were a number of other promises made and a little bit of political to and froing, but that was the bulk of what he had to say. RF Kennedy, who as well is a presidential candidate, independent presidential candidate this year in the US, promised to sign an executive order directing the US Treasury to purchase 550 Bitcoin daily until the US has built a reserve of at least 4 million Bitcoins, which would be a phenomenal number. Of course, the 1 million Bitcoin reserve that US Senator Cynthia Lummis is promising, and she actually introduced her legislation this week. She's now got that out for review. That's publicly available to read. She's aiming for 1 million Bitcoin, which is, of course, roughly 5% of the total Bitcoin supply. But 4 million Bitcoin would be a phenomenally large amount to attempt to acquire, and might even be a challenge to acquire that much Bitcoin. First up, Adam, what is your take on these key announcements? They're obviously landmark, and how do you think this could, or what do you think this could mean for the US and for crypto policy globally?
Yeah, great intro to the conference, because there was so much to unpack, and we say every cycle is different, but you should be careful of saying that. But the reality is this one was different, and it's different because you have ex-presidents, potentially future presidents, coming to a conference about the future of money, whether it's a global reserve or a currency or just some type of reserve or something to go against adversaries, in the sense that if you heard Trump say that, we want to get on this first before China does, I would suggest America's in some way coming late to the party, certainly not in the retail space or in the institutional space, but when it comes to the government space, it's now obviously something that all governments have to look at. So what happens in America affects the rest of the world, as we can see over and over again. And what we want to talk about today, Liam, is not being pro-left or pro-right, not at all. What we're talking about today is these are political campaign issues. This is what the presidents, future presidents potentially are coming forward to the people and saying, this is how we're going to embrace this technology. So in the first instance, we have to say, well, are we going to turn our back on the internet of value? And I would suggest that any nation that turns their back on the internet of value will probably end up like any nation who turned their back on the internet of knowledge, that is the internet itself. So this thing is not going away. It's been around for 15 years. And you can see that it's getting stronger and stronger. You've got two presidential candidates talking about how they would embrace it and adopt it. But I actually go back a step further, and you think about what Michael Saylor said during that conference, where he said, basically, the first nation that catches on to the fact that they can print their fake funny money, their fiat, to buy the Bitcoin, they're going to win. And I would suggest you've got a lot of nations at the moment at the starting line, if you will, trying to figure out who's going to pull the gun first, figuratively, to start printing that money to buy the Bitcoin. Now, as you mentioned, America has a bit over 200,000 in Bitcoin reserves. That was, kind of taken from proceeds of crime. And what is scary, and perhaps what pushed the price around recently, is that we saw that once Trump coincidentally made that announcement, the political power in place at the moment started moving that crypto around. They started moving that Bitcoin from one wallet to another, spooking the market, potentially as a sell signal. Has it been sold yet? Doesn't appear so. Did it scare the market? Absolutely. So now, whether you're on the left or right of politics, you cannot stick your head in the sand. You have to actually look at what Bitcoin is and look at the future of money. Now, the big challenge for any government, anywhere in the world, who used to have the freedom of printing money out of thin air, essentially debasing their currency and diluting everyone's holdings, and imposing an invisible tax on their people, and if you're the global reserve currency, an invisible tax on the world, you can't do that with Bitcoin. So governments are in a very interesting place, left or right, no matter which nation they're in. The power of the past of being able to print money and diluting everyone's holdings and front running the value of that money before the rest of your people could, that's coming to an end. It's coming to an end because people are realizing that the biggest scam in the history of humanity isn't Bitcoin, it's fiat. And now that we can feel inflation and we can talk about money and we're learning about money, and so many people who never knew anything about money in the past are embracing money as the foundation, the layer one of life, everything you do in life, family, health, wealth, love, and happiness. Money is the foundation to enable all of these things that you want to do in your own time with your own freedom to move forward. When your money is eroded and taken away from you without your permission, and at a rate that's not even transparent, as we're talking about the CPI, it in fact becomes a political issue. In crypto, we try to stay away from politics, but the reality is you can't, because it's so deeply intertwined. Economies are made up of people. People are made up of emotions. Those emotions lead to actions, and typically those actions involve spending money or votes. One way or another, it involves the movement of money or votes to get a political party in or to consume. So these worlds crash together in a Venn diagram. If you could draw a Venn diagram of what crypto is, you've got the psychology of money, economics, the political space, you've got technology, you've got all of these things that overlap. But finally, in this Venn diagram, if you will, it's now politics coming into it. Back in the day, it was just the crypto bros. Then it was retail investors getting more savvy. Then you had institutional investors getting into it. And now it's nation states getting into it. So this is the next part of the Venn diagram. I'm very excited. I'm just very interested to see what the opposing candidates will do. And I guess the last part of this rant is, some people say it's all lies. It's all just to buy votes. Well, ultimately, we can't know that until these political candidates are or are not voted in, and whether they do or don't enact their policies. I'm very fascinated to see how the United States maintains its massive power as the global reserve currency without the ability to print that currency. If they front run the market, which I think Trump was alluding to, and they move quickly to get these big reserves, perhaps they can maintain that power. But the question is, how much is China doing? How much is Russia doing? What are they doing in that space? We can speculate and we can look at what we think we know on the news. But I would suggest there's a lot more happening in the background than we realize. We've seen this with banks saying Bitcoin bad whilst they've been scooping it up in the background. Perhaps political parties around the world are doing the same thing.
It doesn't take a genius to add up the maths and think that if the US scoops up, around about 5% of the supply, with Lummis's plan to acquire 1 million BTC, obviously 1 million of the 21 million in total, or if they go further and act on RFK's plan to scoop up 4 million, which is almost 20% of the total Bitcoin supply, that does not leave a lot of room for other countries. or other institutions or other companies to continue to acquire that level of treasury or that level of Bitcoin for their treasury. It's going to be a really interesting race once it starts, and it feels like we're very close. It feels like we're on the starting line with nation state adoption. Of course, obviously, El Salvador has previously enabled Bitcoin as legal tender, and there's a number of other smaller countries around the world that have been a lot more pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto, but a mover like the US starting this race for the first time would be a pretty significant starting gun. And so I'm also really looking forward to seeing how that race plays out. What could this mean for Australia? If the US is looking at a strategic Bitcoin reserve, how does that impact Australian government policy or Australian companies and institutional investors?
Great question. And the reality is, although this triggers some people, you look at the history of the relationship financially, militaristically, culturally. We follow a lot of what America does. There is certainly difference, perhaps the right to bear arms or even a Bill of Rights in itself. But an easy way, in my experience, to make money on the traditional markets is just simply watch what the US markets are doing. And most of the time, Australia will follow suit. If you look at the cultural adoption of certain, I'm trying to choose my words here carefully, cultural adoptions of the thing of the time, whether it's about gender or religion or sexuality, we often follow suit with what America does. You also see it with music and movies, and there's so many aspects where Australia follows what America does, and that also translates into the financial markets. We can certainly see that when the Fed raises or lowers the interest rate, typically Australia does the same thing. We can see that when America goes to war, typically we're going to war. So there are so many deep interconnections between these two cultures that it can't be denied that whatever happens in America, it will absolutely have an effect on what happens in Australia. Where I foresee the future of Bitcoin in Australia is once we see the United States adopt it as a reserve. Now, some people get upset that it was supposed to be a currency, or it was supposed to be this, or it was supposed to be that. Ultimately, that doesn't matter to me. What matters is it's just being adopted. Whether it's a reserve, a daily trader, a layer one, a currency, a speculative tool, doesn't matter. What matters in the scope of this question is, in fact, that whatever America does, a lot of the world will follow suit. So we will, in my prediction, if America adopts this as a reserve currency, as a reserve holding, or as a strategic reserve, you are going to see Australia, we will have to follow suit. But as we spoke about this, if you will, this race, it's almost like a reverse run on the banks. So when we have a run on the banks, everyone's sprinting to get their money out of the banks. I see this as being inverse with Bitcoin, is everyone's going to be sprinting to put their money into Bitcoin. And if we go with the thought experiment or the potential of nations printing money to buy Bitcoin, they will deflate the purchasing power of, they'll deflate the supply of Bitcoin, so increasing the purchasing power because there will be so little available, but they will inflate the crap out of their own money supply, which will deflate their purchasing power. So essentially they will print lots and lots of money, causing massive amounts of inflation for fiat, but then pushing all of that money over into the Bitcoin space with very little available. Now, we were speaking about 21 million. Of course, Satoshi holds 1 million. You've then got 1 million that's still in the code to be mined, a bit over 1 million. So that brings the supply down to 19 million. And forecasts show that we've lost about 4 to 6 million. And we get the number through people who admit they've lost their Bitcoin that hasn't moved for up to 15 years. So the supply could, in fact, be as low as 13 million. And then when we say a nation's going to buy 1 million worth of Bitcoin, or as JFK was saying, Junior, if we're talking about buying 4 million, you're then looking at one nation getting 30% of the available supply, not the total supply, and potentially not the circulating supply, but certainly the supply that we know that we can get access to. The next supply shock is what's happening on exchanges. With a bit over 2 million of Bitcoin available, now, of course, if Bitcoin goes up to 400, 500,000, potentially $1 million, as many predictions are out there, then of course that will push more coins back onto exchanges, as some people will be taking profits. But then if you follow the Michael Saylor model, people won't want to sell their Bitcoin. They never sell and they borrow against it. So you have nations, institutions, fund managers, and retail investors scrambling to buy as much of this stuff as they can. Then those who understand Bitcoin not selling the Bitcoin, therefore borrowing against it, my friend, I think this is a long way of me saying that in my lifetime, I'm very confident that we're going to see a 1 cent Satoshi. I think we're going past that now and even looking to a $1 Satoshi. Admittedly, in the future, the dollar will be so inflated in supply, therefore deflated in purchasing power, that a dollar won't be worth very much. So my eyes are on a 1 cent Satoshi, potentially a $1 Satoshi in the future.
Wow. A 1 cent Satoshi would obviously be huge, and that would occur when Bitcoin reaches 1 million US dollars. But of course, for us in Australia, a 1 Aussie dollar cent Satoshi would be a little bit lower than that, about 650,000 US dollars. That would be pretty enormous. This is a lot of kind of macro, and macro can be hard, particularly for your everyday person to understand. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of policy and politics involved. So I want to really simplify it down. I'm an everyday Aussie, and I hold Aussie dollars in a bank account as my savings. I might have invested in a few shares. I might not have been able to buy a house yet. Obviously, cost of housing is a really important topic here in this country at the moment. My groceries are going up. My insurance is skyrocketing. My costs of living are really high, and my wages aren't really keeping up. Why should I care about Bitcoin? Why is this a potential solution to the everyday problems that I face?
You frame that question perfectly, because everything's going up. And the answer is, in fact, in the question. You can't afford not to be in Bitcoin. People are realizing, we talk about prices going up, and many are catching on that. In fact, it's not the prices going up. Sure, the nominal amount is going up. It's just that your purchasing power is going down. They inflate the money supply, which takes away your purchasing power. To make up for that loss of purchasing power, they have to put the prices up. But real wages are not keeping up with the price of living. Therefore, we are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. I can feel, I've never been on paper so rich in my life, yet I can feel the pressure of daily living. And it's odd. I felt like I had less financial pressures 15 years ago, but inflation has never been so high. The money supply of fiat has never been so high, but it's all centralized to the top. So the reality is, if you're very rich, you need to put your money somewhere, because as Michael Saylor showed at the conference, whatever you put it in, it's eroding very quickly. Keep it in cash, it's being eroded unforeseeably fast. If you put it in property or stocks or bonds or assets, it's still being eroded. So at the rich end of town, you have to put your money somewhere, because that cash reserves is going to be eroded very quickly. At the low end, if you will, where people are struggling to make ends meet, they also have to protect their money, because their super is being eroded. The property that they're trying to get into is getting too far out of reach. Their daily living expenses is too much to keep up, so they need an alternative. We came for the Lambo, but we stay for the revolution. Now what we're realizing, that the speculation is only a component of it. It's actually a necessity. We need a hard, sound money. No matter who we are, young, old, gay, straight, black, white, male, female, rich, poor, we all need a hard money. And the true hard sound money that we have at the moment is Bitcoin, not gold. We don't know the supply of gold. We do know the supply of Bitcoin. No one even knows the supply of the US dollar. America doesn't even know it. The M1 and M2 money supply is off the charts. So no matter what nation we're in, including Australia, we need to protect ourselves from the invisible, brutal, and immoral tax of inflation.
Absolutely. I've just seen somebody drop a comment in the chat, and definitely fact check this, that property prices in Perth are growing by an average of $448 per day. That is just wild. I mean, that's 2.5 times or more what somebody would be taking home on an average wage per day even. That's insane. What's your crypto market outlook for the rest of 2024 and into 2025? I think we've been pretty bullish on the long term for today's episode, but let's move it to the short to mid term for the second. What do you see for the next 6 to 12 months in crypto and Bitcoin?
Look, statistically, we see that we typically have Rectember, so September should be a rough month, and then we have Rocktober where it takes off. So if we go off past performance, everything's actually panning out as it should. I was looking at some of my old X posts and videos of just a year ago, and Bitcoin was like under $30,000. And we forget that so quickly. We're worried about a price movement dropping down into the 50s or 60s, but we're still so far ahead. Now, to be fair and to counter that, we have to actually account for inflation. So how much has it gone up? It's so difficult to get a real anchor point of how much a dollar's worth or how much a Bitcoin's worth when we're comparing Bitcoin, a finite resource or asset, to an unlimited asset per se, being the dollar. But ultimately, I think we're going to have some more sideways movement, probably a bit of a pullback in September. October, we should statistically see it go up. But the real question, Liam, is what will happen in November? What will happen after the presidential elections? So if the left gets in, maybe it's not so pro-Bitcoin. If the right gets in, maybe it's more pro-Bitcoin. But I actually say it doesn't really matter, because what we're actually finding is that Bitcoin is becoming a risk on and a risk off asset. When there is lots of cash in the economy, when the global liquidity supply is high, people like to roll the dice, and they seem to be putting it into crypto and some of these digital assets. But equally, when inflation is really high and people are in trouble, they need to go to the safe haven of Bitcoin. So as we move into a Bitcoin evolving into now both, and very ironically, a risk on and a risk off asset, I'm excited to see the future. I'm very excited. And I'd say Max Kaiser, I'll repeat what he said, which is very interesting. A young viewer watched one of his presentations and they said, "Are we too late for Bitcoin?" And Kaiser said to this young kid, he goes, "No, we're probably too early." And what was so powerful about that is that the real benefits of Bitcoin from Kaiser's perspective, and I'd probably share his thoughts here, is that the real benefits, the global, fiscal, environmental, global security and benefits may not really be truly understood from Bitcoin for another 50 years. So from a speculative point, is it too low to get 1,000,000% return on Bitcoin? Yeah, probably. But is it too late to see the benefits of Bitcoin for humanity? Absolutely not. In the short to medium term, I think we'll track sideways and pick up. In 20 to 30 years, I'm very excited.
Me too. The way I've always thought about it, definitely as someone who wasn't super early into Bitcoin, obviously I'm a younger guy, and I wasn't into Bitcoin in 2013 as much as I would have loved to have been, but I compartmentalize it, and I talk about it with, my wife or my friends, is I save in Bitcoin. I don't invest in Bitcoin, I save in Bitcoin. Because when I look at the long-term opportunity for this asset, and I look at the long-term opportunity cost of not holding this asset and holding my funds in fiat, in Australian dollars, I think it just makes sense to save in an asset which is going to hopefully protect my purchasing power over time, rather than see that erode slowly over the next few years. I want to finish with a quote as well. And this was actually the quote that Saylor finished his talk this week at Bitcoin 2024 with. And it just resonated with me so much, because I think it speaks to this digital arms race, the starting line that it feels like we're at. Even though Bitcoin has a almost 15-year history, it does feel like we're at the starting line of a new digital arms race for Bitcoin. It's a Satoshi Nakamoto quote. It might make sense to just get some in case it catches on. If enough people think the same way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think you can exchange people there for companies like MicroStrategy, for nation states like the US, like El Salvador, like maybe Australia in the future. And of course, basically everybody. And I think that's a great way to think about Bitcoin today, for even the individual Aussie who is, facing some pretty significant pressure when it comes to their weekly bills. Thank you so much, Adam. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a bit of a BTC Maxi episode with you. And that was heaps of fun. We'll definitely have to have you back soon. I'll finish with a disclaimer. Please note this discussion includes insights from non-affiliated third parties and key opinion leaders. Binance provides this platform for informational and educational purposes only, and is not responsible for any content or insights provided. This information should not be considered as financial, tax, or investment advice from Binance. Thanks so much for joining us, Adam. That was really fun.
Cheers, Liam.